Hello and welcome to episode 310 of Something About the Beatles podcast. Now, if the title of this episode, The Beatles' Legacy, seems a bit broad or vague and you're not really sure what it's meant to be about, let me give you a little bit of backstory. First, you might have recently heard a conversation on another podcast called Some Things Considered, hosted by my friend Sean Murphy, who is a writer. And that was not really a Beatle conversation. That was us just kind of riffing on creativity and our career paths and how we got to the place that we're at now through our passions for writing and, in my case, the Beatles and whatever else, and just how it gets expressed over an array of platforms. But it led me to thinking back to when I first did my first Beatle book, Fab Four FAQ. That was me coming up with a book title that didn't have the word Beatles in it because I didn't want it to get lost in the shuffle. I wanted it to stand out a little bit more. And FAQ was this idea I had where rather than from one extreme being dense, scholarly, impenetrable works on one end and the other being lightweight, anecdotal, sort of hearsay, not fact-based books that were out as well. I wanted to do something that sort of deconstructed the Beatles story, where each chapter was a topic unto itself. So depending on what aspect of their career you're interested in, you could seek out that chapter and find a deep dive into whatever it was, concerts or their films or songs where not all four Beatles were on there, or guest appearances from other artists on Beatle records, whatever it was. That was how that book was put together. And it ended up being so successful and popular with the publisher, Hal Leonard, that they wanted to expand it into a full-blown series, covering other acts and then eventually other topics, everything from baseball to UFOs to film noir, you name it. So, as part of my duties as the series editor, I was tasked with finding writers to contribute books. So to that end, we're talking the early 2000s now, I was scoping out all these blogs and places where deeply knowledgeable people were writing about whatever their passion happened to be. And that was how I found an awful lot of the writers for the FAQ book series when I first started. But I also made some friends that way, and one of them was Sean Murphy. He's got this podcast, as I mentioned, called Some Things Considered, a writer who was doing a lot of rock stuff, but he has written plenty of other books, including Please Talk About Me When I'm Gone, which was a memoir of his mother's 5-year battle with cancer, which coincidentally came out about a year before my own mother died of cancer. He also has written a book of poems called Rhapsodies in Blue, as well as a collection of short stories, This Kind of Man, and a novel, not to mention A Nice Life. So he's been busy with his podcast, with his writings, with other creative folks out of the college that he is connected to out east. He's a big Beatle fan, big music fan, and we'd long wanted to have a Beatle conversation, and so this is it. But to circle back to the FAQ books, another writer I did find was a guy from Canada, George Case, who ended up writing the Led Zeppelin FAQ book for the series. And funnily enough, he had just reached out to me recently about an essay he'd written that was sort of a response to the Ian Leslie book, John and Paul, A Love Story and Songs, that we've talked about a bunch this year, and I had Ian on the show. In it, he poses the question, when is enough with the Beatles? What if we reached the point of diminishing returns in examining their story and their history? And Sean and I had already planned this conversation anyway, but that came immediately before we convened for this, and it's like, you know what? That's a really good starting point. So this show entitled The Beatles' Legacy is basically a conversation on why are we still talking about the Beatles? Do they have any relevance to anything going on today? What is so enthralling? Haven't we done it enough justice? Haven't we covered it enough? So at the other end of this 90 minutes, you will have reached the same conclusion we have. Hell no. But got to start somewhere. If you haven't already checked out Sean's show, I would absolutely recommend it, Some Things Considered. And anybody who hasn't yet subscribed to the SATB newsletter, feel free to. It is just been upgraded, so it's a lot more stable, and everybody signing up is getting what they are requesting. And moving forward, it's going to be a lot more interactive in terms of polls and things like that. I really want to get you, the listenership, to weigh in on stuff that will help guide the direction of the show going forward, for sure, and anything else that we end up doing. So to get on, it is SATB 2010 at Gmail, satb2010 at gmail.com. But in the meantime, my conversation with Sean. I will start with your first line of your response. When is there a point of diminishing returns with the Beatles? Is there? I get asked all the time. It's funny. The first time I'd mentioned this somewhere in social media, something I was talking about where I was at some book event in Chicago at Navy Pier back when I think 2.0 came out. And the host, the speaker of the event was Peter Sagal. And I'm already like, oh, damn, it's Peter Sagal. For anybody who doesn't know, Wait, Don't Tell Me on NPR, the quiz show. So he's got some status, and he sat himself next to me and we're talking, getting to know each other and all that stuff. And he caught me off guard once he sussed out what I was there for and what my background was, what my claim to fame was, as it were. So he goes, so tell me this, why the Beatles? And it's like everything I threw at him, just first things popping into my head. Nah, I don't think that's it. Nah. So I've been thinking about that ever since. It's been like 15 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, if that's both the rhetorical question and our kind of entryway, I think my response to you is, and my response to anyone would be, the fact that would even be asked, it gives us an opportunity to talk about why the Beatles are such an inexhaustible topic, and that you and I certainly want to make clear, I always want to genuinely defer to your expertise. It's very rare that I'm in a room with someone where I'm like, is there anything I can bring to the table as it relates to the Beatles? But the fact that we are still talking about this, and I can answer in the affirmative with such confidence, like the fact that they still matter is its own answer. But then it's like, okay, well, give me some answers and give me some reasons. And I think you and I would say, you got all day. And that's the whole point. It's like, to me, the Beatles are an inexhaustible topic. And there are myriad reasons why. But to me, they kind of loom like Shakespeare or Beethoven or Van Gogh. Like, they define entire histories of an art form, and then we can get fascinated not only by the works, but how they changed the forms that they worked in.
Absolutely. This is to the people like us who have made the Beatles a big part of their lives. There's no escaping the fact that once you get, I don't know if seduced is the right word, but pulled into their world beyond just casual, oh, that's a nice song, or this is a nice album. We have that with scores of artists in our lives, that we don't take it any deeper than the sounds we're hearing. There's something for a lot of people, and it was true in 1963 and 1964, it's just as true now, which I see the evidence of every day. You want more. You want understanding. You want to know what is behind the effect that they have on you. And you and I have talked about, in tough times, and I've had this conversation with other people, first-gen fans that have been on my show, that they represent this pocket of joy, and they've always delivered, and they've never let us down. And how many things can you say that about?
Exactly. And I think with the Beatles, it becomes the volume of those. Like, if I just casually think back to my life, I can add my name to that list of someone that, the Beatles came to me when I was a kid. So I can literally associate milestone moments in my life with their music. But so they have rescued me on so many occasions. But it's not that there are other bands I don't love more or equally, but it's over the course of time, it says something that, wow, the Beatles and this catalog, which depending on how you slice it, on one hand is this limited amount of time. On the other hand, it's like this billion year compressed into this decade. But the sheer volume of times I associate memories of my life listening to this music, what more need be said in terms of like, gosh, it's just the gift that keeps giving. I never tire of these songs and the memories they conjure, or the associations I then make with other artists, or the ways that our culture continues to be influenced. There's no other word for me. It's inexhaustible, this well, and it's all positive.
And the thing is, it's way beyond the dozen odd albums that they made and the songs. That is completely satisfying. There's something there for every taste, of course, and you then go into the solo albums if you're so inclined. But there's something about the effect that they had that I think they projected something that they look to us like some kind of example to live our lives. Right out of the gate, you see them on The Sullivan Show. If you're an American fan, it would have been more evident in Britain and other forums that these guys are celebrating their friendship. It's like you pick up on the fact that They're clearly all friends. There's the one moment I've isolated, and I used it in one of my talks where I think they're doing She Loves You on the first Sullivan Show appearance. And you see, it's from the right of the viewer of looking at the Beatles on stage. John turns his head to shoot a glance, smile, something right at George. And you see George's reaction because he's facing the camera. This big grin back at him, like, look where we're at. Look what's going on here. And I just remember that caught me. It's like, wow, it's a blink and you miss it thing. But that spoke a ton about the inspiration. It's like, God damn it, tomorrow I'm getting a guitar. I'm getting my buddies together. We're going to make a band.
Totally. And again, we could talk for hours just about the kind of interpersonal vibrations and energy and positivity that created this magic. But I think about over the years, how many interviews have I read, everyone from just say Ozzy Osbourne to Ian Anderson, or go down the list of people say, yeah, the moment my life changed was watching the Ed Sullivan Show. So there's like a whole story there, or a series of stories. What we're talking about with kind of the personal association culturally and historically with memories. But as a writer, I wasn't inspired to be a musician in part because of, lack of ability, but I can still apply the Beatles and have applied listening. Like for me, a seminal moment was when the anthology collections came out, and being able to hear these outtakes and the development of a song like Strawberry Fields, and thinking, this is how revision happens. This is how resilience happens. And the reason I mention that in particular is I think speaking of the inexhaustible well, we tend to think the Beatles, they are sui generis, but we're like, well, they were just touched. Paul, John, they were just touched by the lightning bolt. No, they worked really hard. And so it's inspiring to hear these people achieving and creating some of the best music we've ever heard, and realizing they were human. It was hard work. It was inspiration. It was the combination of sticking with it. That's absolutely guided and inspired me in my own kind of modest attempts to create work in the world. So again, it's an inexhaustible well of inspiration and lessons to learn from. And I think we do them a disservice if we approach them or any iconic artist and say, well, they were on a different level. I mean, they were. But they were human beings that sweat and had fear and struggled with insecurity, and that all informed the music too.
That's a really, really good point. And to your point about you listened and were inspired by the Beatles, but you felt you had no musical talent, therefore you took it in a different direction. That didn't stop plenty of people with no musical talent from picking up the mantle, because that's how powerful that pull was. It's like, well, I haven't made music to this point, but maybe if I just apply myself, something will come from it. And I include myself in that. It was very much inspired to be in a band, in part because of the Beatles, in part because anything somebody's really, really good at makes it look easy. And you think, well, how hard can it be till you start doing it? But you put your finger on one of the things that I think is one of the implicit lessons of anthology. Hardcores like us might have been familiar with a lot of the bootleg stuff of outtakes and first run-throughs of different songs, but that sort of codified it and put it out there for the public to absorb. And Strawberry Fields is a fantastic example when you see all the stages that brilliant masterpiece had to go through to end up being a brilliant masterpiece. We are told by anybody that's picked up a Beatle book, whether it was Hunter Davies or Philip Norman, sadly, or any other full-scale biography, that they worked their tails off before they even showed up on the doorstep of EMI. It's not an accident that the lowliest regarded group out of Liverpool that, people are writing in Hamburg, well, Alan Williams, don't send that bum group down here. They're going to ruin the scene for everybody. Well, guess what? That bum group was the one that outshone everybody coming out of Hamburg. So the absolutely transformative power of hard work, no matter where you start out talent-wise. It so happened, as you said, these guys were supremely talented songwriters, but with the best quality control in the world once they connected with George Martin. And just John and Paul, that dynamic between them, so esteemed were they in each other's eyes that anything I bring in, it's got to pass muster with this guy. And if absent that, what are they? Jerry and the Pacemakers? I don't know.
Right. And I think that also underscores, when we try to get our hands around what they achieved, when you start thinking about it in just very practical, basic terms, like, so 1963, and then 3 years after that, we have Revolver. And then 3 years after that, we have the White Album. And then, the Abbey Road is like, these were, eons of achievement and evolution and revolution and changes and profound development of this talent. And we think about bands today, and it's like they put out an album every 5 years. I mean, some of this, it speaks to the hard work, but also how they really set the paradigm. Like, this is how you roll. When you're in your prime, you carpe diem, but I think it shows, the indefatigable enthusiasm and energy of Paul McCartney. But I think it's fair to say he drove himself harder than many artists ever have. And again, I'm inspired. So I'm inspired by the results. I'm grateful for the productivity, but I'm just in awe of knowing that, just like, say, we talk about Michael Jordan, anyone that's at that level, when you peel back the layers and look at their life, they're obsessed, they're driven, and nothing is more important than what they're working on. So again, I think it is a happy accident, like a song like I Am the Walrus, like some of these things that just drop out of nowhere and are indescribable, but we need to kind of give even more respect than we do, which sounds, is only you and I, right, could be talking about, well, are the Beatles, just too overdone? It's like, I don't think we've actually still addressed how hard they worked and how much we should revere what they did.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like historically, up until maybe the last decade, possibly two, our sort of framing of their history has come to us through the perspective of white males and their white male fandom of a rock group. And all well and good, but it's a fraction of the whole story. And so the women have been stepping up. We've been getting all these new, fresh perspectives beyond a litany of a chronology and this is the music. So we get the music critic take, the Ian McDonald Revolution in the Head, that sort of analysis. And the beauty of their story and their art is that there's room for all these perspectives that hadn't been considered before that fell off the story. We're now in this age where the fandom and the impact and the role it played in their career, certainly, but the sort of feedback loop between artist and audience, that they were impacting each other. They were reflecting each other, something that hadn't really been considered before and now is. And it feeds this insatiable interest in their story, going back to the why the Beatles. Well, there's more facets in that jewel that we haven't even looked at, laying there in plain sight.
Yeah. And I would be remiss to not say another kind of basic observation, but how many, if we go across all art forms, music, painting, movies, books, how many artists are there that are really like beyond debate, like that you can tie together different cultures, different time periods, men, women, different languages? The Beatles have to be on that Mount Rushmore of, there's little debate. You can cross, this doesn't just apply to white dudes or British dudes or people who are stuck in the 60s. It's like the Beatles speak to everybody, or, so many people through so many different cultural barriers. There's something happening there that really does go way beyond enjoyment of the music. The enjoyment of the music, and I think you are one of our, our most eloquent spokespeople that help illuminate that. Why do we enjoy it? How did it work? That's important, and we should just celebrate that, and we do. But it's so much deeper. I think, again, that gets back to, why do these guys matter? Why are you still talking about them? It's like, maybe we aren't talking about them enough. Robert, other than maybe Beethoven, I can't think of anyone in my life where I'd be like, have I done that to death? Like, I've left it on the field. I'm good. Let other people have a chance. It's not that I feel like I need to say more. It's I find myself wanting to talk more. There's just something to that that's at once explicable and completely beyond my comprehension.
And that's the thing. I'm always reminded of that quote about dancing about architecture. The words even convey all there is. The joy is in the groups. That was the starting point, and it's always going to be there. And people ask, well, how is it? You can hear, I saw her standing there, or twist and shout, 60 years after its creation, and still moves you. It still grabs you in the way few other records created in 19. That's where it begins and ends. But there is so much more. You'd spoken to this cross-cultural appeal, every gender, every demographic. Something that was just brought to my attention that I completely had no idea existed is apparently there's a documentary called The Beatles in India. It's not about the Rishikesh story. It's about the Beatles as a Beatlemania phenomenon in, Eastern culture. It's almost like no accident that George so embraced it, because there was some kind of synergy already in place going back to the first record of theirs heard there, maybe it is a British colonial thing that there was some sort of connecting ether in so disparate a culture. But that whole country, suffice to say, at least the younger generation, was completely caught up in and swept up in Beatlemania the way everybody else in Western culture was. How many things can you point at that had the same effect?
Well, and you hear it right in the music. These guys, in addition to being geniuses and super locked in. I mean, for me, right, if anyone were to ask, like, all right, but what is it for you? I'm definitely a fan of the mid to late work. Like that's what is, ceaselessly fresh. It never gets old. But thinking about Lennon and McCartney in particular, well, and Harrison in the Eastern influence, but McCartney was out on the town, listening to Jimi Hendrix, helping discover some of this talent, embracing all these other cultural forces. So the Beatles were setting the tone for the Summer of Love, but it was also already a reflection of all these cultural changes. And these guys were both insatiable and curious and humble enough to let that seep into the music, listening to the Byrds, right? And seeing how Rubber Soul, like, that sounds different, but we can trace. Oh, the Beach Boys are getting in there. They were both setting the new rules, but they were allowing all these other influences that made the music bigger and more expansive and more reflective of this kind of multicultural energy.
And that receptivity, it speaks to their complete and utter aversion to repeating themselves or adhering to a formula, right? They were, while, John was the only one that went to university, went to art school and failed miserably academically.
Right.
But there was the headspace that had their scholastic career panned out differently. I think it's safe to say at least John, Paul, and George, knowing what we know about their intellect that manifested in later years, were all university material. They were all people that they're culturally aware and receptive and flexible and curious, bottomlessly curious about everything. And it makes you wonder, okay, they wanted to have a hit record. That's where it started out. They were fans of records. They wanted to be part of that currency of the stuff that inspired them. Well, the stuff that inspired them specifically, Elvis certainly, Lonnie Donegan initially, Little Richard. Within those three artists, maybe one could even make the case for Chuck Berry, not a lot in the way of forward movement in those guys. They had their sound and they just delivered variations of it. Elvis changed only through longevity, but that was fueled by the need to create soundtracks for those terrible movies he was making. Of the early artists, the one you can absolutely point to as a sort of precursor of the Beatles that was absolutely not standing still and was evolving was Buddy Holly.
Mm-hmm.
And we lost him so early on, dead at 22, which is unbelievable. But the reverberations of what he set in motion, what the Beatles are to us, clearly Buddy was to them. And maybe that's why he resonated so strongly with them as an artist and as an example. Everything from the 4-man lineup to, let's bring this experimental aspect. You want a pat on your thighs for this percussion? Great. Put a Celeste on this track. Whatever it was, they recognized that you're not bound by the conventional paradigm of rock and roll records. You can go beyond that, still create something that will appeal to that same audience, but is different, is taking a step out of that boundary. And I think that's the one artist I could think of that they were disciples of that had that going on. I mean, obviously they borrowed from everybody, Everly Brothers harmonies, and the Black artists particular in terms of soulfulness, in terms of lyric content, in terms of groove.
Mm-hmm.
But shifting and expanding the paradigm, at what point did that enter their heads as, hey, we can do this? Was it their own just natural boredom with repetition?
I mean, I think about whether it's from a movie or real life, like, the business person that achieves a milestone and is already at work on the next thing. Like there are the people that are driven that are, they are seemingly insatiable. And when we apply it to so many other fields, it becomes very ugly because it's a kind of competition. It's a zero-sum game. The Beatles, like I said, I'll maintain, and you could educate me on this because you could give me actual evidence, but it seems clear to me that they were pushing themselves, especially Paul, harder than anyone else. And I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the recipe for success. But I mean, when we try to really grapple intellectually with how did they do it, again, I am very comfortable with a certain amount of lightning in a bottle, could never be done again, one in a zillion. But when to me, what makes them endure, to me as an adult and a critic and a fan is this drive and the way that they just not only were changing music, indelibly, they were doing it at a scale. You get Rubber Soul and Revolver, and I think for most bands, it would be like, we're done. What more can we accomplish? It's like, but actually, we've got Sgt. Pepper, and then we're actually going to do the White Album, Get Back, and Abbey Road. I mean, it's truly mind-boggling, but it's this combination of all these influences developing their own style, which is crucial. Maybe the part of the Beatles' magic is, what is the Beatles style? And it's like, well, what year are you talking about? What song are you talking about? To me, one of the many reasons, right, that the White Album is just inexhaustible is even on that, you're getting kind of a history of British music, you're getting a history of rock music, a history of everything. And I just love that they weren't going to be confined even on a particular album by a style, and they make it work by the sheer force of energy and their talent.
And that's a great example of an album where, John would say in hindsight, oh, that was where the split happened. Me in a backing band, Paul in a backing band, George in a backing band. And I think too many people take that to heart. And it's not true on their close inspection, especially with John's songs, because I think John's songs, most of all, are the ones on that album, Julia Accepted, that are the true band performances, where you get the other guys stepping up and running with it in the way we associate with the Beatles earlier on in their career. Paul is getting to be a bit more of an auteur by that time, for sure. I'm going to call the shots. But you listen to what those guys do as band performances, particularly on John's material, and it's just phenomenal, the synergy that still exists. And then you think about, they slogged it out for 6 months. They did the pre-production work of demoing a good number of songs that they just, in this meditation camp where they're supposed to be learning TM, instead they got their acoustics and they're compulsively creating material, a lot of which would not even end up on the White Album, would end up years later, right? Like Circles from George and Cosmically Conscious from Paul, things like that, India. So they're all creating way more music than they have a need for. I think it speaks a ton to one aspect that we haven't mentioned to this point, that on the heels of that, they put out 30 songs as a double album. And at the same time, they've reached the point that, well, maybe we do want to do some kind of live situation. We don't know what yet. We know we definitely don't want to do stadiums and screamers anymore. We're done with that. They do the Hey Jude video. They've got people up on stage with them. They got a tremendous buzz out of that. So they take that director, Michael Lindsay Hogg. In between, he does Rock and Roll Circus, which has got a bit of a controlled audience situation. What can we do? We're going to do a TV spectacular. The fact that we're going to do this within 1 month, actually, they'd wanted the original live date was going to be like January 19th or something, which is ridiculously insane. Less than 3 weeks, but Ringo's got to go off and make a film. And by the way, it's going to be all new material created in front of the cameras. You have to have tremendous confidence in yourself to at least put that on the table, as Paul did. And the others don't say, you're out of your freaking mind, Paul. They're like, okay, let's see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, what do gods do? They do godlike stuff. And again, it's that drive, that obsession. Also, I'm sure there was a part of Paul, like, there was a competition. There was a wanting to be part of the conversation. He didn't want to be bored, or it was bubbling over to the extent that he had to find a channel for all this energy, which of course began to rub the others the wrong way. And you mentioned, I really appreciate you mentioning the synergy on the White Album. Anyone that knows that really understands. However it was described afterwards, that was a band clicking on all cylinders as a band. The story I love to tell, and I'm sure you've told it more often and better, but for me, just to take one example, in addition to loving the song, but I love the story of Ballad of John and Yoko. Never mind the White Album, never mind Get Back. Here's a lark, and this is when it was a song about Yoko, the rupture happening, whatever was really true, but her presence being unwanted. And here's a song John wanted to sing about her, enlisted Paul. Paul, game as always, comes in the studio, provides unbelievable backing musicianship and energy, and turns what maybe would have as a solo would have been an okay song and turns it into a Beatles masterpiece. So even on the subject matter that might have rubbed the other bandmates the wrong way, Paul was so ebullient and ready to get in the ring and lift John's material up. I can't hear that song without knowing that story. So the song itself, without any context, kills. I never, ever will be tired of hearing that. I listen to it in the car and it makes me happy. But knowing that Paul came in and even when they were quote unquote ostensibly fracturing, making one of their most beloved and happy, positive songs, again, it speaks to that weird chemistry that only they had.
And again, it speaks to the joy that's projected through those grooves. It's not a band performance, but it's an incredible simulation, to coin a phrase from Beatlemania, and it still satisfies as a Beatle record if you were so inclined to like just judge it on the tunefulness and the energy, and there's the harmonies and just all those little musical details harkening back to their early love of rock and roll that are present there. You get the joy in their hearts, like, yeah, this is a contemporary situation, but I'm going to take the music of my youth that I love and put it in that framework. And what's not to love about it? So, yeah, that's a great thing to put your finger on. I was also thinking about when we were talking about what they brought to the world 63, 64. There was a great quote on the show from Jeff Martin, I believe, where he said, they gave us what we wanted before we knew we wanted it.
There it is, right? And I actually think that that's maybe a really handy definition, not just for art or the best art or art that endures or art that we feel compelled to talk about and analyze.
Mm-hmm.
And that also touches on something I think that you and I have talked about a lot behind the scenes. There's a real big difference between an obsessive, which again, to each their own, but people that collect autographs or they need to know every detail about a band almost because it's a obsessive compulsive type thing, which, more power to anyone that scratches an itch. I think when we're talking about you and me, I won't even put myself in your company, but talking about myself, there of course is an obsessive love of this band, but this isn't I need to be the best Beatles fan I can be, so I need to know every detail. It's like, their music is so reverberates in so many ways, it almost obliges you to what was going on in London on that cold December day when they worked on Penny Lane. What was going on in America when, they toured Candlestick Park? It's one of the reasons I appreciate, your ongoing labor of love, helping others further contextualize and appreciate the cultural, historical aspects, because it both enriches the experience, but it helps us grapple as mere human, as mere mortals with what was actually going on during all this explosive creativity.
Well, that's the thing. If you enjoy the work and you want more, to me, it's the next obvious step is, well, what informed this work? What was going on? You brought up the backstory of Ballad John and Yoko. It's just John and Paul at this point in their history where the chasms are opening up over Alan Klein and business and all that. Yet, for these guys, it was always about the music. Paul, arguably of the four, certainly by 68, 69, is the biggest Beatle fan out of all of them. He loves this band. And yet the blind spot is how he's driving them nuts with his hands-on micromanaging of every aspect of the other's creativity, right? Which gets talked about in the flower pot conversation. So it's been a festering thing, but it's just, more evidence that despite their superhuman creativity, they're still human underneath it all.
Yeah. I mean, I can look at Paul and I just gave the Ballad of John Yoko. I can think of Hey Bulldog, his contributions to a Lennon song, in the studio.
A song tracked on the fly. It's not like they...
But his enthusiasm is so palpable, the love of the creation and the energy. But I can also appreciate the Paul that drove the bandmates to distraction, recording Obla Di Obla Da or Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Like, I love Paul for that. Like the multitudes and the contradictions, the perfectionist. Arguably, did Paul keep the group together when John may have kind of nodded off literally and figuratively or gone into Yoko land, or George, was losing interest or wanting to do his own thing? Paul was at once the glue, the manager, the coach, the player coach, but also the prima donna that was driving them insane. And it's like, there it is. They were human beings. So we have to understand these multitudes to appreciate, how this work came out.
And I think for fans at a certain level, there's an element of, okay, you absorb all this information, but a lot of it's contradictory, right? For 50 plus years, we were told the most miserable sessions on earth about the Let It Be Get Back project. And then all of a sudden, Peter Jackson comes. Now, granted, 57 hours of film, he turns into 8 hours of what I call the monkey's reel, which he got under the skin of it.
I love that. Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. But there's so much stuff out there, as you'd said in like our off-camera correspondence, books about the Beatles. It's like there was just an incredible amount of analysis where people are trying to figure out, well, what's true, what's not? Is it somewhere in between? Was this miserable? Were these the most awful, darkest sessions, how they described it to John and George to the end of their days, and then Ringo and Paul up until suddenly Peter Jackson lays this stuff on them of them goofing around, having fun, making jokes. So, and the White Album, we told the most miserable, those were the tension sessions. Jeff Emerick quits. George Martin takes an unplanned sabbatical, and Ringo quits. And yet, as we mentioned, they're working together as a band. As Ringo had said, I like that better than Pepper because we were a band again.
Right? I mean, yeah, for sure.
But two contrary thoughts could both be true at the same time, right?
Yeah. And you also, you make me think about something that, again, even if I were to assess my own evolving kind of understanding of the Beatles, I can remember, one of the reasons, one of the uncountable reasons I'm so glad Paul is still with us, is having this, what I would call an extended and well-deserved kind of victory lap of approbation. There was a period there, and again, I don't want to talk to the student talking to the master, preaching to the choir, but, speaking only of my own engagement with this band, there was an extended period of time, post Lennon's tragic death, where he became a saint for good and bad reasons. But Paul really, was diminished in the public eye, generally speaking. And I'm talking about conversations I'd have going back to college, where you'd know who the real Beatles fans were because you'd have the hipster say, yeah, Lennon was the heart and soul. Paul wrote all the pop songs. It's like, you don't know anything. You've never gone deep. I bet you've never even listened to sides 3 and 4 of the White Album. But I love that even within the most talked about band of all time, history is never completely written. We talked about this on our podcast the other week. Understanding was it Paul that was the prime mover and the leader? And it's like, it was all those things. They all considered John the leader up till the end. Paul revered John. There's no question. I don't think there's any question Lennon envied Paul's clarity and enthusiasm during 66, 67, 68, 69. All of these are true, but it just proves that our own understanding of what made the Beatles, it's like the answer is all of that.
Absolutely. You just put your finger on something. You just made a thought pop into my head. You're a super cultured, knowledgeable guy. The fact that so many people that consider themselves fans have to frame it as this either or thing, John versus Paul, instead of, what you prefer, your left hand or your right hand. It's an idiotic premise to begin with. To what could you ascribe that? Why do you think that is? What are these people missing?
Well, I think it's an opportunity for a kind of a half-assed analysis and needing to take it. I think it's a very American, which isn't to imply it doesn't happen in the UK or anywhere else, but I think it's a very American phenomenon to be like, this was a serious band. It drives me crazy as a prog rock guy. Well, punk rock was a return to the roots, and, these prog guys had their heads up their ass. And it's like, fair enough, and we could debate that. But the prog rock guys were actually competent musicians, and they were pushing themselves, where I look at something like the Sex Pistols, it's like that was just as much the Monkees, a manufactured, very cynical enterprise. So when I see like the editors at Rolling Stone, certainly in the 80s and the 90s, talking about Sex Pistols were real rock and all this other stuff was pretentious nonsense, it's like, I could make a compelling counter argument exactly the opposite. So I think the John Paul thing, I don't know, like I love talking to my friends that are fellow Beatle fans. We have a running joke, like I'm a Paul guy or I'm a Ringo guy. There's a natural, just like a particular athletic team. Who was the real leader? Who's the MVP? There's a human impulse to do that. But I do think with the Beatles stuff, I wonder if Lennon hadn't died in the way he died, when he died, would the engagement of Paul versus John have really registered in the public consciousness? I just think, with his Playboy interview, and then he dies, goes out on such a high note. And then, Paul had his thing with Michael Jackson, and, he was making okay music in the 80s. Like, it's just fascinating to me. You can't isolate and understand, but it's a long-winded way. To answer your question, my best guess is I think it's a very human and a very American impulse. Like, but who was the best? I need to understand what explains the Beatles and who was the real boss. And it's like, why do you even care anyway? Even if you could identify that, even if the band themselves said, this is our best album and John was the best, that's open to debate. So I'm never satisfied with anyone having a the ultimate opinion, including the band members themselves, because once the music's made, it belongs to the public.
Right. Absolutely. Well said. I think see it as sort of a lizard brain thing that you're not operating at a high enough level if you can't grasp the nuance that it was an alchemy, that it wasn't Team John, Team Paul, Team George, whatever, that together is how the greatness happened. And it's the only way it could have happened. You're free to like whatever solo stuff you like, but can anybody with a straight face say that there's anything they did individually that's the equal of their greatest moment in the Beatles, or that 90% of what these guys are going to be remembered for are the songs credited to Lennon McCartney? That's just a fact that I think is pretty well inarguable.
I think it's completely inarguable, and I think you can apply that to so many other epic bands. I think of Cream, I think of Pink Floyd, the list goes on, but like these bands, even the ones that for understandable reasons, right? Like Cream couldn't stay together. That wasn't, I mean, it was egos, but they hated each other. But in my opinion, none of them individually made music at the same level they did. Certainly, I've long been fascinated, because to me, it's the closest to the Lennon McCartney, the Roger Waters, David Gilmour. Like, well, Roger Waters wrote the lyrics and he was kind of the Paul in the sense of he kept the band going, pushed to make the concept albums. But it's like, we've heard Roger Waters solo stuff, whether you like it or love it or loathe it. I don't think there's even a debate that anything any of those guys did when they weren't in their prime. And Robert, that even to me peels back an even different layer. So yes, I'm in full agreement that the alchemy, the perfect word that you talk about, it was the essence of them at their height of their powers. But also a lot of these bands we love, how many of these bands in any genre of rock or any time period were making their best music in their 30s or 40s? Like there's also something to me that's endlessly fascinating about the rock musicians, apex seems to be those early years and that insatiable drive that does dissipate, I think, for cultural, artistic, human reasons, but very few examples I can think of where you look at a musician in rock, I'm not talking about jazz or classical rock musicians, where it's like, oh, they're totally doing their best work in their 50s. Not saying that doesn't happen, but to me, there's something very interesting about bands that have that alchemy and that energy to burn in those early years.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I've heard people discuss this with other artists. Well, what about Bob Dylan or what about Paul Simon or somebody like that with some longevity in rock? It's going to come down to tastes, Is Donald Fagen making his best music as outside of Steely Dan? I don't know.
Right.
What do you like? But maybe clearly, I don't think it's much of an argument to say the most revered music is the music under the brand Steely Dan. You could point to specific periods. That just seems to be a thing. Is there a literary corollary you can think of where somebody in middle age was actually that's when they delivered their masterpiece?
So I think this is my own kind of self-delusion since I'm a writer, but I find that with it's almost the exact opposite. I think the written word is an art form where one almost invariably improves as they mature. So I would imagine a lot of writers are doing their best work in their 30s to 50s, where a lot of musicians are doing their best work in their 20s. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I actually don't think most writers are doing their best work when they're very young men and women. You have the Salingers and the Hemingways, even the Faulkners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I could list you hundreds, if not thousands of examples of writers that were doing their best work at an advanced age. So I do think that's fodder for not only a conversation, right? That's a whole course, a college course in what are the real differences in the aesthetics and the art forms. When do people reach, peak performance? I mean, athletes, right, is such a human thing. You're only at your peak physical condition to a certain point. You can't be a better basketball player at 50 than you were at 23, but I think you can be a better writer. I would welcome, whether from you or anyone, to me, that's also something I would love to talk about, like debate, just discussion, pushback on that. I'm here for it all day, but I think a compelling case could be made that with writers, it makes sense to me. Like you're reading more, you're doing it more. There's something about rock music where there's certain drive and energy that whether you get old and fat and happy or complacent, I'm endlessly intrigued by that I think most rock musicians do their best work young.
That's a good point you put at the end there about comfort, because I do think comfort is the enemy of good art. Just as a general statement, I think it's true of a lot of people in rock, because that's mostly what we're talking about here, that they're established. They've gotten every honor, every, multi-platinum album and all that stuff. And whatever they're producing then generally is a hell of a lot less interesting than the stuff they made when they were poor. That's, I would say, that's not a recommendation, kids, that I can think of one or two acts that I thought made much better music when they're high than before they dried out.
Yeah. And again, it brings us back to what we were saying earlier, Robert. Again, speaking for myself, like one of, again, the myriad examples of influence that I find is you could say the Beatles, right, lived within those 10 years, multiple careers. They were already from the Fab Four, Beatlemania years, and then the mid period. The fact that, and we could go deeper on like a Strawberry Fields or I Am the Walrus, like they were already the best. They were acknowledged as the best. And for several years after that, arguably they were still pushing themselves, or Paul was pushing himself harder than ever. There's something so unbelievably heroic to me about that. Like you have scaled the mountain. You've won. Again, and just for lack of a more, universal example, of Michael Jordan. Dude, you won 3 in a row. I want to win all in a row. Then you get into what kind of human being is capable of that, right? The books that are written about to be that good, you've got to be an asshole. Another reason I've always loved Paul, by all accounts or by so many accounts, here's a guy that is worshipped and still seems to be a pretty grounded, good human being. It's like, what more can we say about this guy when we would excuse, probably, hypothetically speaking, like less savory behavior? I'm not talking about interpersonal, but just if he was a jerk. If he was a demonstrable jerk, be like, well, he's Paul McCartney. He's allowed to be a jerk. But the fact that he seems to be just this happy dude that's still kind of in awe of what he did and mystified by it makes me love him even more.
That's another aspect that I think is fair ground for examination now. There's been efforts in the past, and most recently in the past year, the Ian Leslie, John and Paul love story book, getting into their heads, what made them tick, the psychological dynamic between the four of them. And again, I don't know if it's simple satisfaction of understanding a phenomenon, or if there's some aspect of, if I take those same ingredients, maybe I too can create a Beatles. Something that, from day one. What's the secret to success? Well, if we knew that, we'd form another group and be managers. I think there are people out there that wish to quantify and understand what made them what they were, in the hopes that, well, okay, if I put those ingredients in a pot, then maybe I too can achieve some kind of greatness. That you can't contrive that. People have tried. And the thing that seems evident in any sphere of success is that everything is kind of a one-off. That is the true exception to whatever the field is, the greatest of whatever that is. Michael Jordan, as you said, he's not the last great basketball player, but it's not like everybody who was great in basketball was a Michael Jordan Jr. after his period. You all find your different path. And, the phenomenon of today is Taylor Swift, right? In every way that people try to quantify recording artists, she's up there. I have no doubt that she's a wonderful human being. You see accounts of that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been efforts made. Your Rob Sheffield has written a book trying to explain why her greatness and her uniqueness and whatever quantifications you can apply to an artist are valid. I guess I don't know if it's just an individual thing, a generational thing, or a sense of having a broad grasp of a lot of different artists from different times. I don't hear it the same way. Or to give another example of just something that's happening this year, the reunion and tour of Oasis. For the people that are ecstatic and see this as a second coming of God, good. I'm glad you've got something to be happy about in this world in this year 2025. I don't hear it or see it myself. Whereas the Beatles, I think, is something that fewer people can argue about. Yes, that they check every box across absolutely everything in terms of appealing to every demographic. It doesn't matter how casual a music fan you are, and you don't have to be into their story. You don't have to think deep thoughts about them to appreciate a Here Comes the Sun and have it lift your spirits on a bad day. So I don't see anything or anyone having the same reach, effect, power, no matter how many records you sell post Beatles. I don't see it. And I don't know, we started this conversation. Is there a point of diminishing returns in discussing Beatles and all things Beatles? Maybe part of the answer to that, if the answer is no, it's because something hasn't come along since then and it's all powerful, all unifying, all influential since then.
That's a great point, Robert. And I think, again, I don't invoke like Shakespeare and Beethoven, Van Gogh lightly. We are, as humbling as this is to even say, right? Because I think back to when I first discovered the Beatles, and that was many years ago, and that was many years after they had broken up. But we're still fresh. Paul and Ringo, God love them, are still alive. They're still with us, but we don't even have the historical, as everything we've just talked about. I think it's fair to say that in 10, 20, 50 years, the legend will loom larger and the contours will take shape of not just like my hackneyed Mount Rushmore analogy, but just cultural, like, through world history. We're talking about the Shakespeares, the Bachs, right? Like these epic, undeniable forces of culture and art. The Beatles are going to take their place along that, and very few people would argue otherwise. And if someone did argue otherwise, the onus is on them to say, how are the Beatles not important? How are the Beatles not good? Why do the Beatles not matter? And you've got your work cut out for you, because there's just this tsunami of evidence to the contrary that they are important and they do matter. You don't have to like them. It would be like someone saying, I've read Shakespeare's plays. They don't mean anything to me. Totally fine. But you can't deny the import and the impact and the enduring. Why do we still stage Shakespeare? The language is centuries old, but Shakespeare is still performed all the time. The Beatles' music will still be performed and listened to because it endures.
Bones are there. They're there. That's the reason. If you're a young person, and not even a young person, people my age that have absolutely no use for Shakespeare, that it's like reading the Bible. It's so arcane. It's so indecipherable. I haven't got the patience. If you don't get that immediate gratification, then the hell with it.
Yeah,
I'm going to go turn sports on. It's like a lot of things that the good thing about the Beatles, as contrasted with a Beethoven or a Shakespeare or anything else monumental you want to point to, is it does have that immediate accessibility, generally.
That's another great point. I think that's really important to point out. And actually, Robert, I think that underscores everything we've talked about. It isn't just that they're good or that they're interesting. It's that what an advantage, unlike, say, jazz or classical or literature. You got to invest the time. You couldn't even if you wanted to read Moby Dick, which I recommend everyone does, you have to understand he was pulling in cultural influences. So if you don't know the Bible and you don't know literary history, you might not appreciate Moby Dick. You don't need to know anything about anything to tee up Penny Lane, right? Or Strawberry Fields and get it and be like, or She Loves You. Like, you don't have to understand music. You don't have to understand poetry. There's something happening there that makes you feel good. That is an unbelievable gift. And unlike literal and figurative sugar, there might be a rush and then you come down or it's not good for you. Yet another example I would give is that the Beatles are something that function as pleasure, but there's never been a come down for me. It's just entirely positive. There's not a single time I've listened to a Beatles song or album and felt like, I wish I could have that time back and not have done that. I need more time to listen to it more.
The closest I guess I come to that is people who complain about the presence of Revolution 9 on the White Album.
I mean, look, Robert, as you and I both agree, because we've been obviously talking off podcast for years. I mean, you and I could go a full week. We could filibuster on the White Album probably for 72 hours without taking a breath.
Right.
To me, one of the, myriad things about the White Album is it is the flaws and the dirt and the grime and the arguable throwaway songs that add up. It's so much better than the sum of its parts.
Absolutely.
And there are very few albums. A lot of people try it with Exile on Main Street. Speaking personally, and as a huge Rolling Stones fan, the same doesn't apply for me. I love the album and I listen to it often, but people, I think, excuse what I consider some throwaway songs where it's like, could that have been a tighter album? The White Album, and I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I wanted to get you on record with this. That's another thing to me, yet another, peeling back the glass onion, right? Like, you could even have people that agree, like, maybe the White Album should have been, perfect one, two-side album, you're going to find very few Beatles fanatics that would agree on which songs. I love that. I love that you can't pin down. It would somehow diminish it a teeny bit if it was like Sean and Robert and these other, 10,000 Beatles fanatics all tend to agree. These are the 10, 15 best songs. I have a feeling all of us would have at least a handful of songs where we would fight to the death, where someone else would say, that's one of their worst songs. That speaks volumes about how deep this goes and how, yes, it's obsessive. Yes, there's passion involved, but it's very genuine. Like I would argue in a non-violent way for my version of the White Album, but at the end of the day, I need the full thing. I need all those 30 songs.
Questionably. It's a similar phenomena with Sgt. Pepper for the people that take George Martin at his word. Well, I would have put Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane. Which two songs would you have given up?
I love you for mentioning that because that lives rent-free in my head. Like, does Strawberry Fields kick off side 2? Of course it does. But shouldn't Strawberry Fields kick off the proceedings? Well, then what do you do with the Sgt. Pepper conceit? It's like Strawberry Fields had to be its own universe, and it just happens to be backed by the best 1-2 punch. I love Penny Lane, but to focus on Strawberry Fields, like that actually would be diminished as a song, even as it would have improved in so many ways. The album, it doesn't fit. They had already moved on from Strawberry Fields to make Sgt. Pepper, and it was only, a matter of weeks?
Yeah. It's unbelievable.
I'm endlessly fascinated by that. But yeah, I can appreciate and not even necessarily disagree with anyone that would say, how can you leave the two best songs off? To me, that again underscores that's why the Beatles were the best. They had the confidence to not even need to include what everyone immediately agreed. This is the best single of all time. Well, clearly that's going to lead your new release. Nah, we're good. We got more gasoline in the tank to make a masterpiece that changes art. Unbelievable.
Geez. Speaking of, we weren't speaking of, but it's been a thought that's been in the back of my head during this whole conversation. The current hot topic has been the Power to the People John Lennon box set of his most unloved, most politically driven album from 1972. And to me, it is kind of irrelevant, the merits of the song, simply because, as somebody put it somewhere that I read, it's the normalization of cultural vandalism to decide that needs to be excluded in 2025. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for asking. I'm absolutely opposed to censorship as it relates to art. If you don't like a particular song or a particular album, don't listen to it. I think vandalism is a perfect word. It's the audacity and the temerity of looking at prevailing cultural standards and assuming, well, we are now at the apex intellectually, spiritually, so we can be the arbitrators of what one should hear. And it's anti-intellectual, it's anti-academic, because the background I have, or at least the part of it that I embraced, is the notion that even the controversial stuff, we're talking about Huck Finn, we're talking about,
Blazing Saddles?
Insert example here, that's fodder for discussion about why it's offensive, how we've changed, how even the most evolved citizens of their time were obviously cultural manifestations of the times they lived in, and to judge them by contemporary standards is a disservice. It's judgmental in all the wrong ways. And again, it doesn't mean you're validating the work that, art monsters do, but it means that you can and should be able to assess the art on its own terms. And then if you want to go deeper and complicate it culturally or historically, great. That's why we write the books. But anyone that says, we are going to decide that this song should be left off the album, to me personally, it's not a hill that I would necessarily literally die on, but it offends every bit of my sensibility when people with the least talent deemed to speak for others.
Yeah. And especially because it seems inescapable in the conspicuous absence of any kind of statement of clarity or justification to have been done purely for commercial reasons. We might sell more if we leave this off and don't even have this discussion because somebody somewhere might get offended about its presence without any sort of explanation of why it's there, why it was created in the first place.
I mean, Robert, to show, my own hand and how deep I go on this and how insane I am, we don't even have to talk about ostensibly, legitimate cultural conversations about, controversial things. I'm still mad at Pete Townsend for when he reissued Quadrophenia. Instead of saying, this is the new version if you want to buy it, he tinkered with the original album. So there are certain songs on the album, the Dirty Jobs at the end with the farm animal sounds, he edited out, and I still hear them in my head, and it annoys me every time because I'm like, you're not allowed to do that. And I could appreciate him or a big fan saying it's his music, he can do whatever he wants. And my retort would be, no, it isn't. That is a document that exists, and you're doing a disservice to the fans to try to clean it up. Or when someone like Roger Waters, right, or any number of musicians re-record a classic, they have every right to do so. But when a musician, not at the height of their powers, assumes that they're doing their best work, they're showing themselves, and it's usually pretty embarrassing.
Yes, and we have the right not to buy it.
Right, exactly. But the difference being, like, so to be clear, am I saying what, Pete can't do a new remix? No, and if people are going to buy those, that gets into the whole obsessive thing we talk about. Someone's like, well, there's a new version of Quadrophenia that's a teeny bit different than the version I own. I need to buy it. More power to all involved. But the original, what we grew up with, should be, untinkered with. That should be available on all platforms.
And it's not just Quadrophenia. It did it with Who by Numbers. It did it with Who Are You. It's like elements your years of listening have branded into your DNA are gone, and it pisses me off. The album sounds better, but to me, it's not the go-to because, God damn it, I want what I heard back when I was becoming a fan, thanks to you.
Yep.
So brand it as alternative universe version if you must, but can we just have what we got acclimated to that you thought was your best work when you put it out?
Yep. And I think there's a genuine, as a writer myself, I appreciate Townsend, again, can do whatever he wants, but it's a disservice to the fans. It's a presumption. It's kind of the mirror image of the censorship we're talking about for a musician to say, this is actually the version you need to hear. These are the fans that have paid your bills and been your fans all these years. It's a disservice to your most knowledgeable and passionate fans to say, actually, I've made the decision that this is the new definitive version at the exclusion of the old version. There's an arrogance there. And I think it reveals something. It reveals a musician who's lost his speedball decades ago and is still trying to kind of dominate the conversation. So I ultimately kind of feel a little bit of pity for that.
I get to where, as a creator and as an artist, you would want to, in your latter day brain, improve what you got wrong the first time, if that's the case. I mean, it's like, I in no way put me on the level of any of these revered artists we're talking about. But it's like, I look at my books that came out years ago, I would change so much of them. I can't even listen to my old podcast because it's like, oh, geez, I could have done this better. Why didn't I bring this up or something like that? Whatever. But one of the things I think about is, I think it was in the early 90s when Zappa revisited his 60s catalog for compact disc, maybe it was on Rykodisc, that he swapped out the drum parts from the 60s stuff and got this massive blowback on that. It's like, are you out of your mind? And I think he had to then remedy that. Same thing, ZZ Top, digital drums.
You and I are so simpatico. So this, for our younger listeners, there were these things called CDs. They were the only way you could get music in the late 80s, and they were very expensive. Big ZZ Top fan. I remember saving up money for the 6-pack, right? That was the big box set. And when I heard Tush and the reverberating drums, I literally never put it in my CD changer again because I was so outraged, and I dropped like $50, which in today's terms would be $10 million. I was so offended and outraged. Yeah, the ZZ Top one is one of many examples, but that, as you can see, it still fires me up decades.
Right. The MTV drums.
Yeah, I just And again, in a sense, though, the other versions were still available. You could get the original album. We're talking about the Townsend thing and the music, or the Zappa thing, where a musician is taking the liberties, even though they own it. It's a disservice to the fans, and oddly, it's a type of censorship, in my opinion. It's a type of authoritarian, like, I will tell you which version of the song you want to hear.
Right.
The misguided arrogance of that rankles.
Yeah, it's crazy. And to circle back to Beatles, and specifically, as we've talked about, your gateway drug was the Blue Album back in the 70s, like in John Lennon's lifetime, right? Like 79-ish or something like that?
Yes. So any opportunity to talk about that, well, again, so for me, you talk about milestones, I would say the acquisition of the Blue Album, that was my, lost ark. Like, to this day, that's still one of the seminal acquisitions because, again, for our younger I had a 45. I had, I don't know if I owned a Beatles album yet. This was right after Beatlemania in 78. And you would hear, the songs on the radio. I had become obsessed with their later work. I had gone through the Beatlemania, the early stuff, acquiring the Blue album where it was all, contained. And again, I was still a young pup, so I hadn't realized, oh, there's Abbey Road. There's a lot more to go. But the Blue album at that time for a 9-year-old was this holy grail of all the songs that I loved the most and was most kind of fascinated by. So we could go track by track, but yeah, acquiring the Blue album specifically to have Hey Jude, finally have Hey Jude that I could listen to anytime. But Strawberry Fields and I Am the Walrus, to my 9-year-old brain, that was what took me from being, man, I really am loving the Beatles. That was the moment Dorothy walks into the color from black and white where nothing was ever the same. Not only as a Beatles fan or a music fan, my entire sensibility, I can still trace back to obsessing over I Am the Walrus, not having any idea. I thought those were the Beatles at the end, with their British voices talking, realizing that was from a play that they allegedly happened to just turn on. Still I got goosebumps literally right now, makes my brain explode to think of the different circumstances just in the creation of that one song.
The utter perfection of not just a Shakespeare play at that moment, they're running a feed into the mixing board, but that scene from that Shakespeare play at that point in the song, unbelievable.
Yeah. So whether it was, and that to me, again, it wouldn't lose any of its magic. Dude, that was totally calculated. Well, it was a genius calculation.
Right.
If it wasn't calculated, it makes you step back in awe of what the Beatles did, of what we can do as human beings, of what the world gives us. It opens us up to to me, I don't believe in magic, right? But I believe in music. That's magic. What happened with I Am the Walrus, lightning in a bottle, sui generis. They're the words that I misheard. I still hear "Rest you, grandfather, rest you," and I still hear that when I listen to that song, crowding around a shitty record player, trying to absorb those last 10 seconds or 20 seconds, absolutely still sends a tingle. But when I think about the 9-year-old Sean Murphy, who of course was going to become a writer, I can't say that without doing this, right? Like that sounds pretentious, but they wanted to become an artist without realizing it. That's where these early seeds are being planted. And I look back and it makes perfect sense to me. Like, of course I was the guy that was going to get a master's in literature. Like, what other kid is that consumed by all these things he couldn't understand, but knew something or some things are going on there that are so much deeper and more profound. But to get back to what you said earlier, which is true, on a fundamental level, it wasn't a pretentious intellectual exercise. The sounds that were coming out were so intoxicating. And the fact that for me, that was when I was first reading Edgar Allan Poe. So again, personally, in my journey, I Am the Walrus mentioning Poe while I'm beginning to read Poe and beginning to write these horrible poems and short stories. To me, the through line of all that is like, wow, it all goes through the Blue album. So yeah, that was, I can still remember like riding home, having acquired it and being excited to get home. Like, so that lives large, like a big moment in my life.
It's large in your legend.
Robert, I can remember looking at the inside flap, that classic picture of them in the park, how cool George looked at that time before the mustache, George's long hair and them intermixed with all those other people. I mean, pre MTV, right? Like, God, you guys had boring lives. I look back on that. I'm so grateful that there wasn't an easy access to, I can go online and look at everything about this, like we all had to puzzle through that in analog, in real time, and just looking at that picture for hours and just worshiping these guys. It was the complete package.
It was a complete sensorial experience, cracking open an album for the first time. The smell, the visual, whether it's the label spinning on the turntable or reading the liner notes, that inner sleeve, which may or may not have had information on it, every bit of it. And then whatever surface defects there were in the vinyl that would stay in our heads forever, just as an 8-track changing channels still stays in my head. And I never even owned an 8-track, just from hearing in my friends' cars. But it's funny, knowing you, Sean, I met you as a rock writer, quote unquote, whatever you would have characterized yourself. You did a lot of writing about rock, and that was how we connected. And if somebody were to say to me, well, What do you think was the life-changing song for Sean Murphy out of the Beatles catalog? I think I would have gravitated, knowing none of this, toward I'm the Walrus, because in my head, that was always the literary Beatles song.
Yeah, and so I think it's hard to argue with that. And this gives me an opportunity to say, then it kind of ties into everything we've been talking about. Lennon himself, whether facetiously or genuinely saying it was garbage, it was a throwaway. Again, even if that was his intent, that to me, again, is yet another example that we can add of why the Beatles are so deep. He couldn't help but be a genius. Like, I hear Elementary Penguin, yellow matter custard dripping from a dead dog's eye. He could say, I was taking a dump and I wrote this on the back of an envelope. It meant nothing to me. It meant a lot to me. And the use of language, like, he couldn't escape his own brilliance. He was a literate guy. He had read. He understood culture. He understood alliteration, wordplay, sarcasm. Man, you should have seen him kicking Edgar Allan Poe. What? I still don't get it. And he could have said a number of other things. A lot of other artists could have tried to be profound. He achieved profundity even through the gibberish. That's the song. I mean, Strawberry Fields may be more sound-wise. I mean, both Walrus and Strawberry Fields sound-wise, but the words in I Am the Walrus not only mystified and enraptured me, they still do. I hear and the sound of his voice at that particular time, just everything. And speaking to the Beatles guy, you think about George Martin, you think about the rest of the band pulling together to add the different layers that make that such a deep. I love the fact that Lennon very well may have looked back on that himself and said, "That was the dumbest thing I ever did." It's like, that makes me love it even more.
That I've always felt, once I became sort of aware and became a more critical listener, how much George Martin was the secret sauce to all those wonderful recordings that we revere, knowing what he did arrangement-wise, that are so memorable and key components, the strings and the brass on both those records you named. And then in the 90s, or whatever it was that the bootleg started to circulate of just the isolations of that stuff. It's like, oh my God, I would listen to this and enjoy this just as a piece of music. Never mind the words and the Beatles rhythm section, all that stuff. This is just incredible, incredible stuff. So yeah, and I think it's one of the things that drives creatives is that who it is you revere, who it is you might, if not emulate, at least be inspired by, and feeling in your gut, I will never reach their level. Even if, so in the case of a Walrus, John has these literary heroes, the Lewis Carrolls and James Joyce perhaps, and whoever else, that in his mind are it. That, well, this is just some stuff I dashed off in the back of my envelope while I was taking a dump. We beg to differ. Right. You might not think it's on the level of your heroes, but you're our hero. And absolutely, everything we create from this day forward, upon hearing your gateway drug Blue album, I Am the Walrus, in our heads, it'll never measure up to that, but maybe to some other people it will, who aren't as esteemed with James Joyce or whatever else. So that's how artists pay it forward, in a way that we stand on those shoulders of giants, might not think we're reaching their level, but for somebody somewhere it may be, and that's what matters.
Yeah. Our best artists are always in conversation with the history and the future. And I Am the Walrus is John being in conversation with his own mind, his times, his influences. And as such, and again, I offer this very modestly, but genuinely just to illustrate a point, you can connect me as one of those touch points, radically changed not only my life as a music fan, but arguably was helping me crystallize, even before I understood who I was and what I was, these impulses of, why do I care so much about this? Like, why is it deeply moving to me? It frightens me. It titillates me, makes me want to cry. What is the power of what's happening there? And then as you get older and experience more, you're realizing this is what art does. This is what the Beatles did. But those are and to get back to the very beginning of our conversation, right? I don't know if we said this before we came on the air. It's like the best way to describe and defend the Beatles is just put on the Beatles, right? It's like, that's the ultimate mic drop. When someone says, yeah, I just heard you guys talk for 90 minutes, still unconvinced, I say, good, let me cue up Revolver. And if that's not going to do it for you, then, maybe that's just not your cup of tea. But I'm not going to argue with you that you should be a fan, but listen to the music. And if you're unconvinced, it's just not for you. But for billions, right, or, millions and millions of people, that's been more than enough.
Yes. And across, as we said, every demographic, every culture. It's astonishing to me, not just the effect that they have of so much inspiration they unleashed, whether it was February 10th, 64, all these guys who started making a decision, I'm going to grow my hair. Girls who might have felt empowered with their fandom in some way to start bands as well. You can't dismiss them. Certainly, whatever channel they had of self-expression, becoming a writer themselves, as you were, it's limitless. And the other thing I think about is the education the Beatles gave me beyond just their music is the rabbit holes they sent me down by putting some aspect in their music, some cultural reference, whatever it was. Buying the Star Club album when it came out, it's like, your feet's too big. Fats Waller. Who is Fats Waller? It must be some rock and roll guy because the Beatles are covering it, right? Send you down that rabbit hole. So what a remarkable engine for learning about the world. And then, of course, in real time in the 60s, TM, Transcendental Meditation, what is that? All these things they turned the world onto, even decades later, that if you become a Beatle fan, you start reading their story, it's like, oh, I want to know more about this. And it just opens these doors wide to discovery. What a miraculous thing.
Yeah. Miraculous thing. The best art, and I would put the Beatles as, creating some of the best art, enlarges the world. It expands your own world, your own consciousness, and takes people like us that are very curious, insatiably creative, and desiring to work out our feelings and thoughts. It gives us more fuel for that. And that, right? What better gift just on a human level? Like that's above and beyond everything else. Like I think we've adequately covered, right? Like, okay, your fans, your obsessives, your writers, your critics. On a human level, this music has undeniably improved my life radically. And so I do have a certain awe that I guess other, religious or spiritual people have for their deities. Like the Beatles are among some of the deities that I, in a very nonviolent, very positive way, and I have to use quotation, but worship in the sense of I'm so grateful for this positive force that has, again, undeniably impacted my life in so many ways. I said it earlier, and it's a cliche, but it is the gift that keeps giving.
Yeah, absolutely. And we attempt to find some kind of answer to the question, why the Beatles? It begins and ends with the music, but it's so much bigger than that, about how they make us feel, how they inspire us, how they give us this shared brotherhood with people that we might not connect with otherwise. I can go anywhere in the world, and if I'm wearing a Beatles shirt or somebody I meet is, you lock eyes, you might start a conversation, but you're immediately sharing some kind of warmth and some kind of wonderful human interaction because of a shared love of something that, I'm not a terribly religious person. I would say I'm more spiritual in my own way, but I kind of reached the conclusion, well, isn't this sort of what religion is supposed to do for people, is that we are one aspect. We're all sharing this world, this planet for this brief time, and we're all from the same stardust, whatever. It seems to me that Beatle fandom is one way to sort of accelerate that and cut to the chase. Like it's got an immediacy to it, which was always part of the Beatles story, whether it was the music or, whatever else they were projecting, is like they got you there right away. And I think like reading Shakespeare, you might have to slog through to get to that breakthrough moment. It might be the same way with religion. It's few people have maybe the patience or the determination to reach that point unless they have no other options. But with the Beatles, you don't need any other options. You will get it right away, and you don't know where those roads will take you.
Yeah. Robert, they may say that you're a dreamer, but you're not the only one.
We're not the only ones.
And, I think my maybe parting salvo would be, I have purposely invoked some absolute, titans in world cultural artistic history, but I would say debates have raged like, well, did Beethoven take what Bach did, or did Mozart take what Bach did and advance it? Did Beethoven then take what Mozart did? And very compelling cases could be made. What I would say as my kind of end all be all is that no one has taken what the Beatles did and surpassed it. So have people, and I've written, like, are there albums I like more? Probably. Have people advanced music and pop music? Sure. But I have a feeling that no acts that ever emerge in popular music will not be in the shadow in some fashion of the Beatles. So there it is. For me, that's the final word. Like, you could make a case. Yeah, Beethoven did everything that was done before him and did it better. I don't personally agree with that, but like, you could make a case. I don't think you can make a case that somebody came along or will come along that has taken what the Beatles did and done it better, or done, more, had more impact, more meaning, more influence, more joy. So there it is. They broke all the rules, and in so doing created all the new rules.
It's unimaginable for something to surpass it. It's like what scope of achievement you would have to put the Beatles in your shadow, right? And I analyze this all the time myself, trying to get inside my own head. I'm very careful. I don't see myself as fetishizing the Beatles. It's not like I try to wear my hair like them or talk like them or, write songs like them or whatever. It's not on that level. And there's certainly moments where I might try to distance myself a little bit. Like you said, there might be other albums we love more or acts that we consider more on our short list of favorite bands or favorite artists or whatever. But there was something about the gravitational pull of the Beatles that even when you can't really think, well, I've gotten to the bottom of it. It's time to move on now and find some other obsession. It hasn't reached that for me. I can't imagine that it would. And we live in a world where, some would say cynically, well, there's always some other money grab around the corner with these guys. But is it a money grab if it gives us joy? Now and Then comes out. And I do remember thinking in advance, knowing it was coming, well, there's no reason to do a show about that. It's good to have it, but it'll come and go. Great. And then once it got closer and I started to see the reaction, and then it did come out, and then there was that 12-minute video, the making of, and then the music video. It's like, this is a profound cultural moment if you are a Beatle fan, for sure.
Yeah.
I don't know how much, but it certainly was one of these things that we got in. Our gateway drug was the Red and the Blue albums. And for another generation, it was Beatles 1 CD. Somebody else, it was Anthology. Now and Then is going to be that gateway for the young kids of today. And I know that to be true because I heard enough evidence of that. So it's like, you think there's an endpoint in sight, but every time you think that, there's not.
Yeah. And, you made me think, Robert. So let me triple down and invoke, Bach and Beethoven. Many of us don't get tired of looking at the stars at night. We don't get tired. Every wave breaking is more or less the same. Kind of don't get tired of looking at the waves rolling in, looking at trees. They shed their leaves. They come back. I don't get tired of looking at the sky. The Beatles are that force of nature that we're so grateful for. They're just part of our consciousness, and they are, like I said, probably too many times, they're inexhaustible. It's a well that just you never reach the bottom of.
And when you consider they just wanted to make records, they just wanted to have a hit. Their goals were no more lofty than that till once they reached that point, it's like, well, we don't want to make the same hit record again. And they just went on this journey that they didn't even anticipate coming. And I would say that's true of us as writers, as creatives in our own fashion, nowhere near the same sport as the Beatles, but we're doing what we can with the gifts we got and trying to honor them, because at some point you recognize, well, not everybody can do this. And it was something I neglected for the longest time, even though I had ample proof in my single digits that I could write. And I didn't know at the time that was something that everybody couldn't do. I just assumed everybody could, even though I knew not everybody could hit a baseball. I knew that at an early age. That was quickly proven on the playground. So I don't know I don't know where I was going with that.
Well, I think it's this deeply human impulse. Again, we talk about the positivity, or I'll speak about the positivity I feel is this human impulse to find something that you love or that you are blessed to be tolerably good at, work hard at it. I mean, it starts to invoke a lot of stereotypes and cliches. Like, you make the most of what you have. You try to leave the world a better place. You try to provide some non-cynical joy to the world. I think that's what many of us find in the Beatles' music. And then again, it extends its tentacles into the acts that they influenced and shaped, and just the songs themselves that are these regenerative, restorative, springs that we drink from often.
Something About the Beatles, created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez, executive producer Rick Way, title song performed by the Corgis. Something About the Beatles is an evergreen podcast.